Chapter 6. Come on through to the other side. And the quote is, live each day as if it's your last, because one day you'll be right. Steve Jobs. Quantum mechanics, time-traveling particles, mind transplantation, alternate realities, Stephen Baldwin movies. The last couple of chapters were a lot to take in all at once, weren't they? A lot to process. But believe me, I feel your pain. And as hard as it was to read those chapters with all that stuff crammed into them, trust me, they were pretty hard to write, too. It took a lot of coffee. However, when we put all of it together, all of these things actually make some sense. And the following short story gives a glimpse into a possible future reality where all of these ideas come to fruition and they were used for technological resurrection. Mind you, it's just a little short story. And the future is probably going to be a lot weirder than the stuff happening in it, but it's still a good way to make sure we're all still on the same page. The short story is titled Operator Error. And this is where the magic happens, the tour guide said. A pleasant smile was plastered across her face, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Jim and the rest of his tour group shuffled to a stop. They were standing in a large hall of the downtown Resurrection Center, and he was finding it all quite impressive. The floors were made of marble. The walls were decorated with magnificent paintings and tapestries, and people in fancy dark suits and little bowler hats were darting all around, looking very busy. Some even looking at data-filled holograms which floated in front of them as they walked. A tripping hazard, Jim thought to himself critically. Wouldn't have been tolerated in his time. Cell phones had been bad enough, but walking around while surrounded by a cloud of holograms? Next to level dangerous. But this was the future, he reminded himself for the umpteenth time that day. And when in Rome, he gave a mental shrug. He was just going to have to get used to these future people's ways. He had been resurrected only a few weeks ago, and there were still so many things to get used to. Even his body. He smoothed down the front of his jumpsuit. It still felt strange to him, the futuristic fabric against his fit, muscular torso. At the time of his death, he had been 65 years old and definitely overweight. But no longer. Since his resurrection, his new body had grown younger and fitter every day. And that morning, when he had looked at his reflection in the mirror, he had barely recognized himself. A youthful, handsome, 45-year-old man had been looking back at him. And a 45-year-old version that looked much better than he had actually looked at that age. Initially, he had been surprised to wake up in the afterlife in an old body, but they had explained that it was necessary for the entanglement to work and for his consciousness to optimally fit into his new body. But now he was aging in reverse, and they had told him that this would eventually stop once his body was biologically 27 years old, the age he had chosen to level out at in his debriefing. The tour guide got Jim's attention back as she waved an arm. A large section of the wall behind her dematerialized with a soft whooshing noise, and the people around Jim oohed and awed as a chamber was revealed. Jim recognized it instantly. A resurrection chamber. He had just been in one a couple of weeks ago, after all. A man in a white shirt and pants was sitting on a stool, watching a holo movie. He was the operator. In front of him, a cloned body lay perfectly still on a slab of stone-like material. A receiver body, as they called it. The operator nodded at the tour group perfunctorily. He seemed extremely bored, maybe even irritated at being on display. "This is a resurrection chamber, of course," the tour guide told them. "You've all been in one, and as we can see, a newly cloned body, identical to our client at his time of death, all the way down to its quantum substrate, is lying on the table, stabilized in our patented quantum replication field, or QRF as we like to say around here." Another big fake smile. Jim moved to the front of the tour group to get a closer look. He'd always been interested in technology, and he found this futuristic stuff amazing. Now that he was closer, He could see the body on the table much better. There it was, a lifeless body, totally nude. He instinctively rubbed at his own chest, feeling the healthy, warm strength of his body. It was weird to think that the body he was in had been on such a slab only a few weeks ago. He looked at the body lying there on the table even closer. He could see the air shimmering around it, the QRF. So, that body doesn't have a soul, right? Jim asked in a hushed tone. The operator heard him and arched an eyebrow smugly. He flicked off his holo movie. Still new, huh? He sniffed disdainfully as he eyed Jim. No, dude, no soul, no consciousness. This is a receiver body. He began to over-enunciate his words, patronizingly slow. Receiver body. Got it, bro? Another tourist grunted. I don't know. It sure looks alive to me. The operator rubbed the bridge of his nose, clearly exasperated, before responding. Look, guys, receiver bodies are made with the most important bits missing. You know, the bits that are actually the consciousness? They aren't there. In fact, this body would die pretty quickly without the QRF. He shook his head in irritation and turned his attention back to his holo movie. Noobs. Ahem. The tour guide tried to stare a hole through the chamber operator even as her smile stayed plastered on her face. Robert! She turned and smiled at the tourist. Don't mind Robert. He's having a bad week. Jim shrugged mentally. The future was so strange and different. It was almost comforting to find something familiar, and he was very familiar with assholes like Robert. There had been plenty of assholes in New York, 2010, his death coordinate. Another group of people walked up just then. They were led by a tall man, clothed in a dark suit. Jim knew this meant that he held some kind of high-ranking position at the Resurrection Company. The man motioned the people following him towards the chamber. They appeared to be related to one another, a small family, and they were giddy with excitement, chatting to each other happily. They formed a small circle around the body lying on the table. One of them, a short woman with blonde hair, waved at the tour group happily. Jim waved back, smiling politely. And look, the tour guide said with a hint of genuine softness in her voice, our client's family has arrived to welcome him to his future. Robert, the operator, still seemed to be exasperated, however. He stood up and spread his arms. He was also chewing some gum with big, sloppy, open-mouthed chewing motions. Hey, ladies and folks, welcome to the Magic Chamber, the Temporal Portal, Resurrection Chamber, Extravaganza, Bonanza Place, or whatever. He whirled a finger in the air lazily. The greatest show in the universe, folks. You know the drill. You've all been here, right? He looked around. Right? Obviously. That's how you got here. He doesn't seem to be taking this too seriously, a woman next to Jim mumbled worriedly. Jim nodded his head in agreement. Robert, still chewing loudly on his gum, began fiddling with controls next to the chamber. Okie dokie. He blew a bubble and popped it. Just gonna look back through time and find this Joker's death moment, coordinate, and lock on. He pushed a button and stepped back. He grinned back over his shoulder at the people gathered behind him. Don't worry, folks. The AI really does all the work. The chamber began to vibrate, and a moment later a soft white light began to swirl above the body lying on the table. The tour guide pointed at the light with one of her long fingers. Now, that is quantum temporal vortex. It's made of quantum particles entangled with the past. The moment of our client's death, to be exact. And in fact, if you pull out your holo guide, you can read all about how we use the phenomenon of entanglement to look through time and transfer the quantum substrates of bodies, which you might call a soul, and then guide them through space-time wormholes into new ones, all the while keeping them safe and intact. Quite fascinating. A member of the tour group raised her hand. So, how does the machine make the soul? Or do we have them naturally? She was a tall, blonde woman. The tour guide nodded excitedly. Good question. Well, our consciousness is really just a pattern. Energy moving in and out of us, like a standing wave. It's a constant chain reaction that starts when the sperm enters the egg and ends when it's interrupted and it cannot be restarted. What we call death. But that thing that comes out of us when we die? The blonde woman wasn't satisfied. The ghost or whatever. That's what I mean. Is that all out of us naturally? Or do we make that with the machine when we die? Oh, of course. The tour guide laughed. The swirling light behind her became more intense. Oh, yes. Well, in order to ensure that the chain reaction of our consciousness never stops, we actually have automated part of it. We have machines that intervene a bit now and give everyone an astral body the moment they are born, which is an artificial energy body that stays with us the whole time we're alive and can sustain our consciousness after our body dies, for a short period of time. Pretty smart, huh? The blonde woman looked pleased. So, we all have these astral bodies, even right now? She tapped her chest as if she could feel it. Yes, of course, the tour guide beamed. We're all very secure. And although there are little problems now and then, people like to mess with the system and have out-of-body experiences and stuff, it's nothing we can't handle at Resco. And when we die, the blonde woman persisted, this ectoplasm body or whatever it is, what pops out of us. Yes, we prefer to call it a ghost, but yes, we pull the ghost out of the client's body, cut its cord, and strengthen it, so it can make the trip through the wormhole to its resurrection point, safe and sound. Amazing, the blonde woman breathed. Of course, so how simple, and God has nothing to do with any of this? The tour guide just shrugged. Well, you know what they say, God works through people. Big smile. Jim already knew all this, of course. He had spent a few days catching up on history. First, artificial intelligence had been created and controlled, something called the singularity. In only a few short years, all diseases and even aging had been cured as men had now full control over his own genetics, and things like racism, ageism, and sexism had become quaint relics of the past. Death itself had quickly become rare, but it had still existed as people died in accidents and explosions, their bodies too far gone to piece back together. Then the AIs had learned how to actually look back through time. A great deal of knowledge had been gained about time, space, and the multiverse, and while altering the past was heavily regulated due to obvious consequences, it had been found that sending and retrieving small particles was possible without causing too much fuss. Instantly, it had become obvious that while it was impossible to go back in time and stop loved ones from dying, it would be possible to transfer their consciousness out of their bodies the nanosecond before they died, bring it into the future, and slip it into a new body. All in an invisible and mysterious way, of course, so that no one in the past could ever know about it, to protect the sanctity of the time stream. And thus, technological resurrection had become a thing. The ultimate medical technology. Not only were people immortal and able to recover from almost any wound, but now, even if they were incinerated in a fiery explosion, they would just be resurrected an hour later. Death had been conquered. It was now totally optional. Jim was fascinated by what was happening in the chamber now, however. He lived through the resurrection process firsthand, but it was still fascinating to see it from the other side. This side. He watched as soft, white streams of light emerged from the vortex and began to form into something more solid. It was so familiar. He could still clearly remember seeing the light at the end of the tunnel when he had died. The sense of peace and well-being. He had a great operator, though, a beautiful Indian woman named Adia. The tour guide was still talking to other members of the group, but Jim was looking at the operator. The man was still loudly chewing on his gum and already watching his horror movie again. What a shame, Jim thought. A low-pitched tone sounded in the air. The operator's eyes jerked up. He looked surprised. Uh-oh, Jim thought. He had seen that look before. Usually on an idiot, just as he realized he had screwed up, and screwed up so badly that he wouldn't be able to hide it. So I will pick up the rest of this chapter in part 2 of this video and finish the story and talk a little bit more about all these ideas.